Hola amigos! Welcome to the third chapter in this Niagara fireworks VFX tutorial. Today we're going to finish this system by adding a series of explosion effects that we will be able to combine and layer just like we did with the trail effects. When combining all these possibilities, we can create a really large number of variations. So without further ado, let's get started. Last week, we created a system that allows us to combine multiple particle effects together by passing an array of trail parameters in a structure. Today we're going to do the same for the explosion. So let me stop this and go to the content browser, and last week we created a fireworks trail type enumeration and a trail settings structure. Let's do the same but replacing trail for explosion. So right click, blueprint, and let's start with the enumeration. So fireworks explosion type. Move it here, and let's add, I don't know, 4 types for now. Simple radial, maybe a different shape, like a disc or a cone. Disc. I don't know what's this one called, but I'm going to call it a sparkler. And finally, I want to also do an image based. So image, simple radial, disc, a sparkler, and image. Now we can save this, and let's create the structure now. Blueprint structure, and we can call this one as fireworks explosion settings. Let's open it up and add some properties next. Let's take a look at what we did for the trails. So we had a start color, end color, and then density, length, and sprite scale, and of course the type. So let's do the same, but replacing length for radius. And that will be enough for our first explosion type. So fireworks explosion type. And we can call this one type. Now we need a few floats. So let's do density scale, radius scale, and sprite scale, and finally the 2 colors, linear color, and we'll do a start color and of course end color. Now we can switch to the other tab and give in some default values. So density, all the scales, set them to 1, and let's set some, as usual, some bright colors. And remember to set the alpha to 1, otherwise your particles will be invisible. And it's because by default, being this an RGBA, all values will be 0, including alpha. So make sure that you set alpha to 1. Now with everything set up, we can save and start using all this. Let's start with the rocket. We can find the rocket blueprint in the content browser, and let's add a new variable. We can call this one explosion settings, and change the type to be our structure. So as fireworks, and we want the explosion settings. Now we don't want one of these variables, we want an array, so right click here to change the type to an array. And now we can compile, and we have a default value that we can add a few different types of explosions. Let's keep it empty for now. And we can move this variable to the explosion settings category. Now we want to make this public, and also we want to expose it on spawn. So check those two checkboxes: instance editable and expose on spawn, or expose on spawn and this little eyeball icon here. And let's find now our launcher blueprint. Now we don't have our new property visible here, so again, as usual, we need to go back and forth. Why is not? Let's change something and save it again and go back. There it is. Now we can create a new variable, and we'll call this one also explosion settings, and change the type to be the same type, and also an array. If you follow the previous tutorials, there should be nothing really new here. We're just doing the same thing that we did for the trail for now. And now we can get this variable and connect it here, and as well as making it publicly available or instance editable here. Now we can compile and save, and we're almost ready. We just need to make some changes in this explode rocket function. Let's start by disconnecting this, and we are still going to spawn Niagara systems, so we can keep this but move it out of the way for now. Now we need to get our explosion settings and do a for each. So it will repeat these instructions for each element on this array, very similar to what we did for the trails. So now we want to break this element into its different components. So we have here all the properties of this explosion, and what we want to do is, just so we only have one spawn system and location, we're going to set a new local variable of the type Niagara system reference. So Niagara system, and then object reference, and don't make it an array, and we can call this one temp Niagara asset. Now let's set this variable, and we'll set it to a different value based on the type of explosion that we want to spawn. So let's do a switch here. So for each element of the array, we'll first check what type of explosion we have, then set that temp Niagara asset variable to that, and then spawn whatever asset we have set it to. Now let's start by creating this first simple radial explosion. Let's compile and save, and let's create a new Niagara system. Actually, let's create a new folder first here and call this one explosions. And let's actually select simple existing emitter, and let's do an omnidirectional burst. We can start with that. Click finish, and we can call this one Niagara system, maybe firework motion, or even easier, firewall explosion, simple radial. This is what we get by default. Just a very simple explosion that doesn't look very much like a firework. So let's start by creating some new user parameters. We need some floats. So we had our radius, then we have our density, and we also had our sprite scale. And actually I'm going to add another one for duration. and we'll go back to our structure in a moment to add it. And then we need two linear colors. So start color and end color. Now let's set all these defaults to 1 and then some colorful orange and pink as defaults. And now we can save, and let's go back for a moment to our structure to add this new parameter. So here we have our explosion settings. We just need a new float here at the bottom, and we can call this one duration. Change the type to a float. I'm going to actually select or drag from the left all the way to be the second parameter, and default value maybe 2 seconds. Back in Niagara, let's change the properties of this emitter to be a GPU sim first, and change the bounds to be fixed, just so we get rid of this warning. We can always change the size of the fixed bound later here. Now we can keep the emitter state as it is, just loop one time, and here in the spawn burst, let's change the spawn count from 100 to a multiply int. Now the first parameter, let's do 250. And for the second parameter, let's drag our density. And as you can see, by default, it will add this truncate, which is to make an integer from a float. And we can keep this as it is. Now moving on to the initialized particle, let's change the lifetime mode to direct set and change this to a multiply. Now the first parameter, let's change it back to a random range float. I don't know, maybe 0.9 to 1.3 or 1.2, 1.3. And then for the B parameter, let's get our duration. Perfect. Now let's change the sprite size mode. Again, we're going to do the same, so change it to uniform. And then change this to a multiply float. The first parameter being again a random between 0. Or maybe not, like 3 and 6. Make them brighter and bigger. And for the B parameter, let's take our sprite scale. Now we can keep the rest as it is. Moving on to the shape location. A sphere is okay, but I want to make this quite smaller. So let's say 15 units. And we could spawn them, all of them in the surface, or maybe half of them, or yeah, maybe most of them spawn in the surface, so we get a more spherical distribution. And now at velocity, let's make them, actually we're going to make this go really fast, so let's change this velocity speed from a random range float to the same as before. We're going to first take a multiply. Here we're going to do a random as the first element between 950 and 1000. And then for the B parameter, this time will be the radius. And as you can see, now we get a sphere this size. If we have the radius, now we get a sphere half the size. Perfect. Now I think that's all for the particle spawn. So on the particle update, let's start by reducing this gravity force. So maybe almost like half, maybe like 500. And then I want to increase the drag quite a bit. So from 0.75 to maybe 5 or 10, maybe 5. Now let's keep this for now and let's press play again. And now, as you can see, by increasing the drag a lot, but the initial velocity also a lot, we get this cool effect where we get a pretty good spherical distribution that kind of stays there for a moment before starting to fall. And that's pretty much the behavior of most fireworks, at least fireworks of this type. That will be pretty good. And let's move on to the rest of the modules. Let's do something about the color of those particles. So let's add a color module and move it above the scale color. Now let's change this constant value for a lerp. So search for lerp and select the lerp linear colors. And this will fade between start color and end color based on this lerp factor. So a start color, we can drag our user parameter. Same for end color. And now for lerp factor, actually before anything, let's just for now temporarily going to select normalize age. So that means that when the particles spawn, they will be a start color. When they die, they will be end color. However, if we just press play, nothing happens and our particles are still white, or they seem white. And that's because here on the next module we are scaling color, but the color that we are scaling is the initial color. So if you think about it, here we're setting the color of the particles, then here we are setting it again to our new lerp, but here we are scaling the value, but we are scaling this original, this original value. So let's go to a scale color and change this color value to scale from particles initial color. Just search for color and scroll down to find the particles color, which is the current color. Now if you do that, now you can see that our particles start in our start color, this pale orange, bright orange, and as they die, they change into this pink. Cool. Now I'm going to do something different here, slightly different. So go back to our previous module, the color, and I'm going to change this lerp factor for a float from curve. Now if we had a linear ramp up, we get exactly the same effect as before, because our curve index is the normalized age. So our normalized age goes from 0 to 1, and this curve goes from 0 to 1, exactly mapped like that, so it's not changed. However, by doing this, actually let's add or let's change the mode on these two curves by pressing 1 on the keyboard or right click on it and pressing auto here. So let's change it to auto on both, and I'm going to move this one left to maybe like 0.8 and set the value to 1, and this one I'm going to move it to maybe like 0.5 and keep it at 0. Now we scrub through our timeline, we can see that our particles start on orange and only change to pink right at the end. You can change this curve to be a different one and play with different effects, but this is something that I've noticed in some of my reference that I was looking for this video. You can get, especially like there's a lot of times that you get red bright sparks that just at the end change to green. And you can even tweak these numbers a little bit more and do something more like that, where they change quite a bit later, but let's keep it like that. Yeah. Perfect. Now I want to do one thing with the color here. We are already scaling the alpha, so our particles disappear at the end, but I'm going to actually move this curve, so instead of starting here at 0, it doesn't start to fade until the 0.5 or maybe even more, 0.7. Yeah, that's a lot better. Also, we have this scale sprite size, which I like how it is right now by default, so I'm going to keep that. But back to our scale color, I want to scale this RGB. And what I want to do is multiply vector by a float. And this is just so I don't have to make 3 different curves, one for each component. So we're going to keep this at 1, 1, 1, and then we're going to make a curve for this float. So we're going to change this for a float from curve. And let's change the default, let's use one of the templates. Let's use the pulse out. And here I'm going to keep this one at 0. Then I'm going to set the second one to maybe like 5. And then the last one at 1. And we can click this button to zoom and see all the keys. And maybe move this one earlier so it gets back to regular brightness, maybe at 0. Maybe 0.4. So our particles start very bright, and then as time passes, they go back to our normal brightness. Maybe even more, maybe like 10. And then we can move this a little bit closer also to 0.3. Let's check it out. Yeah, I think this is pretty cool. I'm going to change these default colors to bright red and green. So I have this bright red, almost incandescent orange, and right at the end they change to green for a moment before they dissipate. Cool. Now we can always change this duration, and then they will fall. However, if you do that, you might notice that once they start falling, the effect is a little bit weird because we don't have any other forces applied. So everything falls very slowly with just the same shape. So let's add a little bit of curl. So search for curl. Oh, curl noise force, and let's see, not very strong, like 100, and very low frequency. So it doesn't affect the initial sphere very much, but it's mostly to break out, yeah, in case someone wants a longer duration, just so it doesn't look too weird. Maybe 150. Yeah, that's pretty good. At least for now. We can save and go back to our blueprint to add this. Let's go back to our rocket and bring it up. And now we can set this temp Niagara asset in the case of a simple radial explosion to the one that we just made. So let's find it, and there it is. Now we just need to set all the parameters. So we can take this return value. Actually, we can promote it to a local variable. Niagara system ref. And now let's set all these variables. So let's start with the density. Oh, sorry. Set Niagara variable, float. And we can copy this one a couple times. We have density, radius, sprite scale, and duration. And of course, we need to reset the target. And rename this variable. So we had density, radius, sprite scale, and duration. And we also have linear color, and we had 2 of those. Now let's also bring our properties, which are here, and this is duration, goes there, density is the one here, radius scale goes here, and sprite scale goes here. And now we have our start color and our end color, and let's also connect those. Let's add some reroute nodes to make things a bit easier to see. Oh. Actually move all these up a little bit. There we go. Oh, sorry. Hopefully this is not very confusing. We're just doing the same that we did for our trails, but in this case to apply to the explosion. I realize now I should have done this in a different order, but it's not too terrible. Okay. We can later make this into its own separate function because we are also going to add new parameters for some of the other types of explosions. So we need to differentiate between types. But now we can save, compile, and give this a go. Let's hit play and select one of our launchers, let's say this one, and add, where is it, some explosions. So let's start with a couple. I'm going to make one radius 2 maybe, and the other one radius 1.4, and then let's make the outside one red to green, and the inner one maybe pink to cyan, and this looks so good. Maybe we can make the inner one more dense. Let's shoot some rockets. So there we have it. We can now combine different explosions, and so far we only have one, and you can always add more parameters to this simple radial or create subtle variations of it. For example, one where the gradient doesn't wait until the end and you have more of a normalized curve, or even add a parameter to control the offset of the curve. Again, the sky, very literally in this case, is the limit. But for now, let's make a couple more types of explosions. Sorry, before that, I took the part where we were setting the properties of the Niagara explosion and selected everything, right-click on it, and select collapse to function. This created a new function that I renamed to set Niagara explosion properties, and has 2 inputs. One is the reference for the particle system component that we created, And the second one is the structure for the explosion settings. And I'm doing the same thing we were doing earlier. So I haven't changed anything past this connection. We're still setting the 4 Niagara variables that are floats and the 2 that are linear colors. And all the values are picked up from a break of the explosion settings. Now back in the explode rocket function, after creating this spawn system, we're just calling this new function with the system reference and the settings, which I'm still getting from the array element. Our second explosion type will be based on the simple radion, so we can right click on it and select duplicate and then rename this one to maybe simple disk. Now to make this sphere, to change this sphere into a disk is as simple as changing the shape location from sphere to disk. Now by default this disk has a radius of 100 units, so let's reduce back to match the one that we had on our sphere, and that's kind of it. The other thing that we can do is change the rotation mode. So right now it's set to default, which is not change the rotation, so they spawn in a disk that is aligned with the vertical axis, but we can change this to axis angle and then change the axis. So this is the x-axis, we can do x and y and then have it at an angle, an angle vertically, or even something like this, or we could set this to an exposed user parameter, but I don't want to add another one, and I'm going to set it to a random value. However, if I just set it to a random value here, let's see what happens. It's random vector, and now we are back to a sphere. So what's happening here is that each particle is still spawning on a disk, but this disk is aligned randomly for each particle. So at the end we have a sphere. So instead of doing a random vector here, let's revert that back to its default value, and let's go here to the emitter spawn and add a set new or existing parameter. Now we can search for vector and call this one maybe disk angle. And now this is the one that we can set to a random value, a random vector, because it's going to be set only once when the meter is created. So when the explosion happens, it will select a random vector. Now let's go back to our shape location, and here in the rotation axis, let's replace this for our disk angle. And let's see what happens if we play it a couple times. It's like that. Now it's like that. Yeah, every time it has a new angle. Perfect. The other thing I want to do is change the size of these sprites based on their velocity. So here in the particle update, let's add, let's search for a sprite scale and add a scale sprite size by speed. Now this module always has to be after the solve forces and velocity because, as you might have guessed, it uses the speed calculation. So let's select it and change the maximum scale factor. We don't want to scale the particles in the x-axis, so we can keep this at 1, but we want to scale the particles in the y, in the vertical axis. So let's say this to maybe 10. And let's reduce this velocity threshold to, I don't know, 750. Now our particles now are slightly elongated, but still each one facing some random angle. So let's fix that by going into the sprite renderer and change the alignment mode. Right now it's set to automatic, which is driven by a value here, but we can change it to velocity aligned. And now our particles are aligned with the direction they are moving. Perfect. And because they are aligned with the direction, now this scale sprite size will make them longer in the direction they're moving. So let's see how it looks. We can see that the particles are very long, and as they slow down, they transform into just little dots. Perfect. Now maybe we can even reduce the scale on the x-axis a little bit to make them thinner, and maybe increase the default density to maybe 300. Cool. Okay, let's compile and save, and now we'll need to add it to our explode function. So this one is still using the same parameters, so we can just now copy this and select the disk entry here, connect it here at the same spawn system, and replace this one. Let's search for FWE, and let's select the simple disk. And yeah, that should be it. Let's compile and save and give this a go. I got here one of the launchers, so let's see the disk on its own. Add one explosion effect, change it to disk, and let's give it a try. Yeah, it's pretty good, and if we shoot a few, we can see that each one is aligned differently. Perfect. Let's combine this with a few other explosions. So maybe this disk is more on the... No, actually, let's keep this one red to green. Maybe make it a bit bigger, a bit more dense, and a bit faster. And then let's add a couple of radial ones. Let's say the first one will go pale blue. Yeah, like something like that. And a radius of 2. And I think that's probably good. And let's make the other one a bit more green. So maybe it starts here. And something like this. Let's make this one just a tiny bit bigger and a bit more dense. 1.5. Okay, let's give this a try. I'm just doing a bit of random parameters, but hopefully it doesn't look too bad. Shoot the rocket, and I think that's actually pretty cool. I think it almost looks like a planet with the ring and the atmosphere or something like that. And you can see that already we have a ton of possibilities, and we're only combining 2 explosion types and 2 trail types. Let's see what happens when we add a couple more explosion types to the mix. Let's do the sparkler first. This effect will use 2 emitters, and the first one will be a copy of our simple radial, so we can right click again and duplicate it one more time. And let's rename this to a sparkler. Let me move it here, and let's start working on it. Now, the first thing that we want to do on this emitter is change the sim target to CPU sim. And the reason is that in this system we are going to use event handlers and events, and those are not compatible with GPU particle systems. Now we can go down the list and see what needs to be changed. Nothing on the emitter state. Next, on the spawn burst, we probably don't need 250 particles. We can go with, say, 50. Next, on the initialized particle, we need to make a few changes. So we can change the lifetime mode to random, and maybe something like 0.6 to 1.4. We could add a second parameter, and I would call it something like delay, which will be the time between the explosion happens and the sparklers appear, or to scale that time. But for now, I think I'm going to keep this as a random value. Again, if you wanted to do that, we just need to keep the direct set that we had before and create a new parameter to hold this, to replace this duration. But for now, like I said, I'll change it to random 0.6 to 1.3. I said 4. Okay, next, the sprite size mode, we can change it. Actually, we can keep it as uniform, but here on the next line, uniform sprite size, change that to the default value by clicking on this arrow. And yeah, maybe 10 is fine. Eventually, we'll remove this sprite renderer, so this is just so we are able to see the particles and see what they're doing. Shape location, we can keep it as it is, and the same for add velocity. Next, on the particle state or particle update, let's go down, maybe a bit less gravity, maybe like 400, so they drop a little bit slower. Yeah, something like that. Drag is fine, pretty high. Now we don't need to scale these sprites, so we can remove the entire module. And the same for the color, and the same for the scale color. So we're just left with these white particles that disappear over a bit of in an interval. You can expand this interval by making the difference between lifetime minimum and maximum a bit bigger. Okay, let's keep going. Curl noise, and probably we don't need that. Make it a bit simpler, and that's it. So if we play it, we just have a few particles that disappear. Now let's select the particle update stage and search for death and add a generate death event, and immediately we're going to have an error here. Now if we go to the Niagara log, it would tell us that before this particle ID parameter can be used, the requires persistent IDs option needs to be activated. So let's do that. Go to the properties of the emitter and click on the requires persistent IDs. So now our particles, when they spawn in some order, and they will get a new property called ID. And this is going to be used for the death event. Now let's actually first save, and we'll create the next emitter now. Now I want this second emitter to be very similar to our default radial, and that makes me realize that I should have copied and duplicated this one before I made all those changes. But we can still go to the content browser, find our simple radial, and then Ctrl+C to copy the emitter, and then Ctrl+V to paste it here. Now, as I explained earlier, we're using event handlers, so the first thing that we need to do in this second emitter is change the sim target to be a CPU sim. Now, let's keep this spawn burst instantaneous, but we will remove it later. This is just so we are able to see what we're doing with our particles. Here in the initialized particle, maybe just make this time a bit shorter, maybe 0.5 to 1.4 or bigger range. We can keep everything else, but I want to change the range for the sprite size. I want to make these ones pretty small, so 0.5 to 1 maybe. So now we have these tiny particles that are really hard to see. And now to make this a bit more apparent, we can reduce the radius of this sphere where we spawn them to maybe like 10, and also reduce or remove the surface distribution, so they're distributed all over the sphere or through the volume of the sphere and not just in the surface. And now here on the add velocity, I want to do two things. I want to stop using this radius because we are still using it here, and I don't want to mix parameters and use them more than once because it will make it harder to tune. And I want to reduce these speed ranges. We could add a second parameter like secondary radius or sparkler radius, but I don't think that will be necessary. So I'm going to just go to this line, the velocity speed, and change this for a random. maybe between 75 and 150. So now we have this small group of particles that fall. Now, maybe reduce the gravity a little bit, like just to 100. Drag, we can keep it, scale, sprite size, color. Actually, in the color, I'm going to restore or change this curve that we're using, where we only change the color of the particles, at the end of their life. I'm going to change this for a default smooth ramp up, just to make this each particle effect a bit more different from the others. So the change happens now gradually over entire life and not just at the end. We can keep the scale color and the curl noise force. Maybe I just want to make it a bit less intense, so maybe instead of 150, just 50. And maybe we could also go back to other emitters later and make them pan, but I think you know how to do that, so I won't bother doing that for the tutorial. Now, as you can see, we changed how the particles look, but it's still spawning from the center all at once. And that's because this spawn burst instantaneous is still happening. So we can keep it, but we also need to add a stage where we process these events. So here at the top, there's this plus stage. We can add it, or we can click it and select an event handler. Now this will add a stage at the bottom called event handler, and then one module that is the event handler properties. So go to the properties, and first we need to set the source to be this event that we created earlier. So we can just open here and select the death event. Now we want to change the execution mode to operate only on particles that are created as a response to this event. And now before we made other changes, let's click here to add a module and search for death. And here we have our receive death event. So the source is just, think of it as setting the data. And here is where we do something with that data. And we are receiving a bunch of data, so position, velocity, acceleration, random float, color, ribbon ID, and coordinate space, but we only need the position. So we can click on all the others and set them to output. Now, if we press play, still nothing happens, or particles disappear and nothing is generated, and we still have all of our particles here at the center. So let's rewind this, and now first I'm going to remove this spawn burst instantaneous, and next on the event handler properties, set the spawn number to maybe like 100. And this is equivalent to a spawn burst instantaneous. This will spawn 100 particles every time that one of these events is received. So now we can disable this sprite renderer and hit play. And now we can see that we have a bunch of randomized explosions that happen at between some a second and a half interval or something like that, or a second interval. Perfect. Maybe we can change this duration default to be 1. There we go. Now we can save and add this to our list. Let's find our rocket. And here on the explode rocket, we just need to add our new Niagara effect. So let's connect the sparkler here and here. And we can change this. And compile, save, and give it a go. So select any fireworks launcher, add one explosion effect. Let's make this a sparkler. And as they usually look. So maybe like start a bit brighter, something like that with 5. Yeah, and maybe increase the radius. Shoot the rocket. That's pretty cool. Yeah, we could add a delay to that one. What is it? The explosion delay, maybe 0.5 seconds. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. Okay, let's make the last effect for the day. Let's actually duplicate our simple radial one last time. And we call this one image or image based. Let's open it up and see what we can do with this one. First of all, we're going to sample an image, so we need an image to sample. We'll need a new user parameter, so search for texture, and we can call this one maybe image texture. Image texture. We can give this a default value, so I have this beautiful cat. And next, I'm going to add a second parameter, and this will allow the user to determine if they want to keep the original colors of the image or just use the image as an alpha mask and then keep or use these start and end colors. So let's do that with a boolean and call this one maybe use image color. Now let's start doing things here. First, I want to spawn a ton of particles, so let's do 10,000. We have a GPU system, which also is we are going to sample a texture, and we can only do that using GPU system. So we can handle a bunch of particles. So 10,000 is a good start. Next, we can keep everything as it is, maybe just change the duration 1 to 1.2, not too much variation, and maybe make this a bit smaller, 1 to 2. Everything else we can keep it as it is. Now the shape location is fine, but we don't need the velocity. We're going to control the position of these particles manually, at least for the first couple seconds. Now, before we do anything, imagine our texture, which is our little cat here. It's a square, right? So we have pixels on it, and we can find those pixels with usually UV coordinates that go from 0, 0 at the upper left to 1, 1 at the bottom right. Now we're going to use give each particle a random UV value, so each particle will sample a different position from this texture. The other thing that we're going to do is move that particle to the relative position they are sampling, so we place all of our particles in a square, and each particle will have the color of the pixel that is sampling. So let's go to the particle spawn stage and add set new or existing parameter. Now we need this one to be a vector 2D, and we can call this one UV pos. And let's do just a random range vector 2D, and we can leave the default parameters that are between 0 and 1. Cool. So now let's add a sample texture. And first we need to use a user parameter here, so we can click and select our image texture parameter. And let's see what happens. Well, our particles are still orange, So maybe it's that we are doing something here. Let's disable that for now. And now all of our particles are white, but we have this checkbox that says apply sample RGBA to particle color, and it checks. So what's happening is that all of our particles are still sampling the 0, 0. So let's change that for a new parameter, UV pos. And now if we play it, they're still white, but if we were able to pierce through this, through this brightness, we can see that we now have a bunch of different colors. And well, it makes sense because actually, let me show it here as well. Because if we disable the alpha, most of our texture is white. So next, actually, let's kill all the particles that have low alpha. So add a kill particles module. And this one, we can set this set bool by float comparison. So as the A parameter, we're going to search for color and select make float from linear color. Now here we can search for our sample color and select the channel A for alpha. Now let's say if A is less than or equal to B, and let's set this to maybe 0.1. Now we kill the particles. So now if we play it, now we have a bunch less particles, and most of them have some color. There's only a few that have very white color, which seems is working, but we are still placing all these particles just in a sphere. So let's go back to this set new existing parameter and click here on the plus icon to add a second parameter and search for position. Now we have a bunch of results, so select the top one that is a common new parameter, and by default it will name it position, so we need to rename this to maybe something like target position. So the reason why I'm not writing to the position directly is because during the first second or so of the particle's life, we're going to have the particles move towards a square to represent the texture. But afterwards, we want the simulation to take over and control the flow of the particles, applying just regular forces. That's why we need to have a separate parameter, and then we'll interpolate between the position and the target position. So now this parameter right now by default is set to the engine emitter simulation position. So let's change this to add vector to position. Now for the first parameter, we can go back and select the simulation position. And now the vector that we're adding, we're going to type a new expression. And give me a moment and I'll paste it in a new workpad session so we can see it in detail. Here's the expression I'm using. We're making a float 3, so a vector with 3 components, and its first component is 0. Then the second component is the x component, or the x coordinate of our UV parameter, minus 0.5, and the third component is the y coordinate of our UVs, minus 0.5. But we are also doing a 1 minus because our coordinate system it's reverse in respect to the UV coordinate system, at least on the vertical coordinates. So why are we doing this? It's because our UVs right now go from, if you take this page for example, go from 0, 0 at the upper left to 1, 1 at the bottom right. And our simulation center is at 0, 0. So if we imagine we scale the UVs and put our particles in positions corresponding to our UVs, and we just do that, all of our image will start in the 0, 0 and will be offset to the right and to the bottom. Now we want our image to be center in the explosion, so we need to subtract 0.5 from both x and y coordinates. And finally, we're scaling all that times the radius. So let me remove or set it back to how it was. And I think because this radius will be expressed in units, I want the user to just have to scale this. So let's say this by default has maybe 1,000 units. So let me actually update mine and do that times 1,000. Now we're still not doing anything with this target position, so let's do that next. And in the particle update, let's add first set new or existing parameter directly. And let's add position. And we're going to search for lerp and select smooth lerp over time position. So our smooth value is the current value. So we can search for position and select either the stack context or the particle's position. And as our target value, we're going to select our target position parameter that we created. Now, the convergence rate means how fast these particles will convert from this value into this value. So let's change this constant one, for a curve. So float from curve, and let's select the pulse out. I want the particles to converge very fast at the beginning, and then maybe at 0.5 stop converging onto this target position, and then just be driven by the regular dynamics of the simulation. So we have a value of 0, then here at 0.1, let's say 0.1. At 0.1 we have a value of 1, and here at the 0.5 time we have value of 0. Now we can scale this curve to maybe like 5, and let's see what happens. Actually, I'm going to I moved the position at least above the solid forces and velocity. So if we press play, where are particles? Somewhere, might be hard to see. Oh, there they are. But they're all going in a weird straight line somewhere, and then they're falling. But this is not our image, or it doesn't look like our image. And if we look at it, it's really hard to see, but it's a bunch of extruded spheres. So what's happening here is that despite we added the UV position first and the target position later, because they are on the same module, the compiler gets a little bit confused, and by the time we run this expression, this parameter UV position doesn't have any value and is still set to 0, 0. Now, how we can solve it, I'm not entirely sure how to solve it properly, but the workaround is just separate these two parameter sets into two different modules. So actually we don't need to do it again, so we can just copy this module, paste again, and then on the first one let's remove the target position, so remove this parameter, and in the second one let's remove the UV position. Right click, remove this parameter, and now if we press play, we can see that our particles spawn from a tiny sphere, go into the image, might be hard to see right now, and then fall. And let me actually, just for now, make these particles really big, like 5 to 10. And we can see that our neon cat is there, and then it fades for a moment. Yay! Now let's do the color part. Now for the color, we wanted to allow the user to control if we wanted to keep the color of the image. Like in this case, we can see the rainbow behind the cat and a little pink shape, and we can see a little bit of his face. But maybe we want to use something like a star. And in this case, we don't care about the color of the mask. We want to use this green and orange. Now, one can think that it's as simple as we have a boolean parameter. Now we can go to our sample texture and we have this boolean here, but if we look at it, we don't have a selector or little arrow here, and we also cannot drag this parameter. We cannot bind it. So how to solve this? Now, the way to do it is we're going to do something similar to what we were doing earlier with our color, and we're going to lerp between this start and end. However, instead of doing it in just the color regular parameter, we're going to set a new parameter. So add a new set parameters and search for linear color. Now we can call this one target color, or maybe gradient color. Yeah, that's better. And we do the same thing that we were doing earlier with a regular color. So it's a lerp, linear colors, and then we can drag our start and end. And we can do the same thing for the letter factor, frozen curve, and then just for now, just do a ramp. Now we have created this new parameter, gradient color. So now let's add another set parameter. And for this one, we're going to set the regular particles color. Now we're going to set this color. Actually, let's go back to the cat because it's a bit more colorful and will be easier to see what we're doing. So right now we're creating a new variable called gradient color, and then we're setting the particle color right now to just a regular white. But instead of that, let's also select a lerp here. Now this one is going to be slightly different than this. For the start color, we're going to select the new variable that we created. Oh, it's called gradient color here. And for our end color, we're going to search for the sample color from the texture. Now let's do that, and actually let's go back to our sample texture and disable this apply sample RGBA to particle color. Now we can see that now we have our particles, and now they go from orange to green, but we still haven't made use of this boolean right now, so currently only have the gradient, and we lost the original colors of the image. Now to bring that back, we have this lerp factor here. So if it's set to 0, we have our gradient, and if it's set to 1, we have our image color. And that's exactly what this boolean represents. So 1, use image color, lerp factor 1, we have the image color, and then on 0, we'll have a lerp factor of 0, and then keep the gradient. So let's do that, and search for bool, and select make custom float from bool. And we can keep the default values, but we need to replace this bool for our user parameter. So just drag and drop. And now if the checkbox is off, we keep the gradient. If it's on, we have the image color. Excellent. Let's play it again. And now we can disable that. We can even change the colors. So from a yellow to blue. Or back to arcade. Excellent. So now let's go back to our initialized particle. I want to reduce the size, otherwise they will be too bright against the dark background. And I think that's probably good. Maybe we can still scale and re-enable this to have the particles brighter at the beginning. I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, maybe make them fade, start to fade maybe only after 0.8. Yeah, we can now save and see how it looks. Let's find our rocket blueprint, and we just need to add our Niagara assets. We can copy this and change this to be our image base and connect the entry and the output here. Cool. Now we just need to add or set up these new parameters. So we can go here to the set Niagara explosion properties function, and let's make first some room. And we'll need a couple new parameters in our structure. So before that, let's open our explosion settings structure, and we need to add two new variables. One is a boolean and the other one is going to be a texture 2D. Texture 2D object reference. We can keep the same names. So this was image texture, and this is use image color. Let's give them some default values. I think that by default, if we're using an image, probably we want to keep the color. And let's set it to our kitty here. Excellent. Compile and save. And now we're going to set those extra parameters only if we need them. So we can grab this type here and do a switch. So before we are setting the parameters, we are checking what type of explosion it is, and if it's a simple radial, a disc, or a sparkler, we can go straight to set the normal parameters. But if it's an image, we need to set these two new ones. So let's set Niagara variable texture and set Niagara variable bool. We can connect the first one to the image, then link them together, and after that we can go back to the default the rest of the regular parameters. So let's rename this. This is our image texture. This is our use image color, and now we can link these values here and here. And of course add a couple reroutes to make things a little bit cleaner. And there's still a bit of spaghetti here, and we could simplify and organize this, but I think that for the tutorial it's probably hopefully clear enough. So let's compile and save, and let's give it a try. Let's grab our launcher and add one explosion element. Let's change the type for an image, and we can keep these default settings. Let's give it a go. And shoot a rocket, and there's our cat. Yay! Doesn't look too bad. We can maybe increase the density a little bit and whatever, but I don't know if you guys have noticed something with this image. Let me open the original one, and here we have our neon cat flying towards the right of the image, right of the space. But here, if we shoot a couple rockets, we can see that the cat is flying towards the left. Now, why is that happening? Well, the reason is that this effects or this image is now aligned to the world. So if we shoot a rocket and we look at it from the other side, now our kitty is flying towards the right. So that makes sense, right? The rocket launcher is aligned in some way and all the rockets will point the same way. Now, however, if we want to change this, right now it's a little bit tricky. Let me open back our particle effect. And here, where we're setting the target position, we're setting this vector that it's aligned to the makes a plane aligned with the x or facing the x-axis and aligned with the y and z axis. Well, the one thing that we could do is rotate this vector somehow, and we could either let the user have a parameter that with the rotation, or at least for this example I'm just going to set a constant value. So let's change this vector from an expression. We have a few options here. We can transform this vector by a matrix, which will require to input a matrix that will transform this vector. And now the vector that we need to transform, we need to set back to this expression. So right now we are not making any changes, and our cat is still the same because our matrix is the default one. We can change these values, and you can see kind of how these values affect right. And you can get a transform matrix from the launcher and then pass that to each rocket and then pass that as a property. Another thing that we could do, instead of this transform vector by matrix, we can do a rotate vector. Yeah. Vector to rotate would be still the same. So type an expression and paste our old expression. And now, because this one is a scale, these values will need to be pretty high, but we could change the yaw if we want to flip it, and then if we wanted, for example, to face towards the launcher a little bit, maybe you can change the pitch to something like that. And now our particles spawn kind of in the correct left and right orientation and facing down. Now we change the radius, so we might need to scale this value, so we probably want to do a slightly different math. And the last thing that we can do here is rotate vector by quaternion. So let's go back, vector to rotate, and type our expression or paste it. And for the quaternion, now we have a few options. We can just type a value here and play with this and maybe expose this as a user parameter. Something like that, and it will be pretty easy to edit. Maybe would be well, anyway, you get the general idea. Let me reset this back to default. Now the other thing that we can do is keep this rotate vector by quaternion, but in the quaternion, let's type vector, and we have find quaternion between two vectors. Now this is very similar to just using a regular quaternion, but it's slightly easier to understand, at least from the user's perspective. So the from vector will be the original x-axis of our space, and we can just search for system x-axis. Now the vector, the to vector, is the new direction for that x-axis. And we know that because of the way this expression is made, our plane is usually aligned with the x-axis. So basically, this new vector will give you a facing orientation. So in this case, vector 0, 0, 1 will point up, and a vector, for example, 0, 0, minus 1 will point down. But what we want is just invert the x-axis, so we want this vector to point like that. So the x-axis will now be minus 1. Now we compile and save and go back to our example. We can finally change this for our subscribe. Maybe not use the image color, and this time should be readable. There it is. Yep, just some subliminal messages. There we go. Now, the last thing I want to do is show you how to use these elements in Sequencer. By the way, thank you Niels Leslie Pringle 3143, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, for posting this question in the comments of the previous video. Now, I already have a sequence here that I created for the other tutorial, but let's add a new one. We can do that either from the content browser, but here at the top we have the level sequences, and we can just click here to add a new one. Now we need to specify a place to save it, so the tutorial folder is fine. We can call this sequence fireworks. Sequence fireworks, perfect. Click save, and by default it should add one copy of this sequence to the level and open the sequencer editor. Now, if some of those things don't happen to you, you can always drag your newly created sequence from the content browser to the viewport, and once it's there, you can click here on this button to open the sequencer editor. Now, in this editor, we're going to need some objects to track and to add keyframes and actions to, like for example these launchers. Now, there's a couple ways to add them to Sequencer, but the easiest one, or a big quick shortcut, is to select the object in the viewport, and now we press track actors to Sequencer. We have the list of actors, but here at the top outside of the list we can see the object that is selected. So click on that one, and now we have our object track. Now we can expand this and click here to add a new track, and we're going to call events, namely the functions that we created for these launchers, specifically the shoot rockets and the stop shooting functions. And we'll do that with an event trigger. Now, we could use a repeater, but that will call the function every frame, and we don't really want that. So let's do a trigger, and now we have our track. Actually, before that, I'm going to expand this sequence to have a bit more range, so maybe 600 frames. See the entire range, and then expand this. Now, let's say on frame 30, we want to start shooting this launcher. So right click on it, set the tracker, the marker to frame 30, and then click this little plus button to add a new keyframe. And then if we right click on the keyframe, we can see the properties, and we have the time, and here we have the endpoint. Now we can create a new one manually, but let's use a quick bind and search for the shoot rockets function. There it is, shoot rockets. Click on that, and we have now a new blueprint called Sequence Fireworks Director BP that has created a new event that will be called by the sequence, and that event is calling this shoot rockets function that we made earlier, or in a previous video. Now we can minimize this because it will pop up again in a moment when we go to, let's say, frame 420. Nice. And we add a keyframe, right click on it, and in the properties, let's bind this to the stop shooting function. We'll do the same, automatically create this event, calling the stop shooting function. And as we can see, it added to the same. It's smart enough to not create a new blueprint for each one of these that you need. Now we can close this sequencer, or actually let's minimize it because I didn't set it up to be autoplayed on the level when the game starts. So just keep it here on the side, and then we can click play to play this level, rewind our sequence and press play, and at frame 30 it starts shooting rockets and keep shooting at whatever interval has been set on the launcher until it reaches frame 420, where it should stop. And that's how you add these elements to Sequencer. And that's all I have for this tutorial, and for now this is also gonna be the end of this series. If you want some ideas on how to expand this system with new styles and effects, I would recommend starting with two new explosion types. The first one, a smoke explosion using an omnidirectional emitter and the same lead smoke material that we use for our rocket trails. For the second one, I would just use an emitter with a single particle and a light renderer. Combining both effects will make your particle explosions, your fireworks, look a lot more realistic. But like I said, that's all I have for today. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, please consider giving a like, subscribing and hitting that notification button. And if you have some suggestions or questions, please post a comment below. See you next time!